Well, thank you very much indeed, and it's a hard act to follow. And I suppose it starts with the first line. That was Homo sapiens, wise man or wise woman talking there. I think we had much to learn. My conversation is really more about whether we're Homo sapiens now, whether we're Homo ARIES, so gas man or gas woman, or whether we're Homo stultus, which is stupid man or stupid woman. So I've got to cover 4.2 billion years in 20 minutes, which will be a challenge in its own right. And I'm going to make you slightly miserable. Because I'm going to do that, I'm going to start with a quick joke. It's the only joke I know about climate change, and it goes like this. Two planets are talking to each other, and one says, I'm not feeling so good. I think I've got Homo sapiens. And the other planet says, I wouldn't worry, it doesn't last for long. And I'm going to start by not talking about climate change, actually. I'm going to start talking about it as this sort of patient that we would all recognise, an average intensive critical care patient. And of course, sometimes something absolutely massive and catastrophic has struck this patient down, and that's why they died. But much, much more commonly, this is an elderly person who's accumulated a progressive burden of disease, and then something bad hits them. And that's the extra thing that tips them over the edge, and they go into physiological freefall. And our planet, I would put to you, is facing the same sorts of challenges. So to familiarise you with this graph, over here we're going to start with the population of the world in humans, and then we're going to talk in a bit about world GDP. So it's the world gross domestic product, as it were, and that's measured in trillions of dollars, all put to 1990 scale, so it's inflation adjusted. So it took 540 million years of human life, for humans to appear at all. That's of multi-celled life. And it took around 120,000 years for humans to pole up, really, and to gradually start increasing their numbers. So if we go back to the year 0, and we move ourselves forward, this is what's happened to human population over that time. And you'll see that it's a pretty dramatic rise. It took 120,000 years for us to reach the first billion, but it took a little over 123 years for us to stick the next billion on. The next billion took only 33 years by 1960, and since then we've essentially been stacking on another billion every 12 to 14 years. We bust the 7 billion mark in 2012, and we've added nearly 500 million more people in the last 4 years. So world population is going steeply upwards. Let's look at GDP. If we go back, that's been pretty well measured from taxation. It's done a very similar and precipitous rise, but those scales you'll recognise are not the same. So if we look at what's actually happened to the amount of money available per person, it's gone up very steeply. I put the wrong number in the next slide, but essentially, oopsie, I seem to have switched everything off now. But essentially, since 1804, world population is by 7-fold, and actually world product's gone up by about 110-fold, not 450. Which means there are a lot more of us, but each one of us has a lot more cash than we used to have. And cash is resources. It doesn't much matter what you think they are, air, water, phosphates, or anything else. We're all using a lot more stuff from our planet. And just to give you some indices of that, we're using a lot more fish. World fish consumption is going up steeply, now per man, woman and child on the planet around 20 kilograms each. Grain production is going up similarly and steeply, showing no signs of falling, and that's because there are more of us, but each of us is eating more. And the same applies to cattle, and you could translate that to anything else that the planet is supplying us with. Applies to water. So this is a nice satellite view of the Aral Sea. In 1989, a little over 170,000 square kilometres of it, and this is what's happened by 2014. And you could see the same thing here. This is Lake Chad starting in 1977. Here it is in 1998. Here it is in 2010. And I haven't just cherry-picked a couple of examples. This is a worldwide problem as we drain fossil aquifers, sealed water systems to supplement that we're using from the surface, and we're running out. We're also running out of soil. It takes thousands of years to generate topsoil, the stuff that you can plant stuff in your garden, And every time you till it, you lose at least 1% of it because you break up the surface structure and it blows away. So start working the maths out. Till something for 100 years, there ain't much topsoil left, and we're running out too. I'll just take a pause for you to read that. The scary figure, every meal you eat in the Western world has destroyed 10 kilograms of topsoil. But look at what's being suggested for the rate of loss of that and when we run out on soil we're currently using for cultivation. Because we're running out of places to grow our crops, to graze our cattle, we've started chopping down rainforests at this rate. That amounts to around 20 soccer pitches a minute of deforestation. And you can't just let that come back either by leaving it alone. And the net result of that, the destruction of habitat, the loss of water, the fact that we're building more cities, paving things over, polluting, etc., means there's less habitat. And as you start degrading ecosystems, removing animals from those systems, eventually they start collapsing. Here's the scary stuff, and this is well within my lifetime, and looking around the audience, probably well within many of yours. Since 1970, this is what we've lost in terms of multi-celled life. That's since 1970. So if you look at what the United Nations tell us, this is what they tell us. You are living through the fastest and biggest mass extinction this planet has ever seen by an order of magnitude. This is huge. And we are currently losing, in terms of species, up to 8 species an hour becoming extinct. Most of that due to us. Now that's nothing to do with climate change. That's just what we're destroying our planet in the ways in which we're destroying our planet now. The acute illness that I believe will be the thing that's the force multiplier that tips us over the edge relates to the amount of energy we require to fund that lifestyle that I've just demonstrated. It takes a lot of energy, and we've traditionally got all of that energy, or nearly all of it, from burning fossil fuels. Now, the fossil fuels drew carbon down as life forms over about 300 million years. So there's 300 million years worth of CO2 stored in coal, natural gas and oil. And we really only recently started using it. It's a bit peculiar, we think we've always done it. But the first commercial oil well was only drilled a little over 150 years ago. So let's just take a journey through. There's the first oil well. There's the first domestic light bulb. A little over 110 years ago. Not much use because there was nothing to plug it into, no grid. A little over 105 years ago, that's the number of cars and concreted road in the United States. It's not very much, is it? First commercial jet ticket. I am indeed that old that I can remember the jet set, the filthy rich people who could afford to buy an aeroplane ticket. Because it was only a little over 50 years ago that the first commercial jet ticket ever got sold. The first home PC, 1973, well, that was the same time as the first experimental mobile phone call got made. So let's look at now. 4 billion light bulbs a year in Europe and the USA alone. That's 126 a second getting sold, compared to none at all around here. 1 billion motorised vehicles on the road that are licensed. 98 people boarding a jet aeroplane a second. Over 1.3 billion home computers, and a couple of years ago, more mobile phones in use than there are people on the planet, because most people have more than one mobile phone nowadays in many parts of the world. All of these things take a huge amount of energy to make, and generally quite a lot of energy to run, and most of that has come from fossil fuels. This is what we burned last year. And that's not going down, that's going up very steeply. All of that is producing a lot of carbon dioxide that is going into what turns out to be a very small atmosphere. So for those of you that have climbed a few big hills, if you're climbing to, let's suppose, an 8,000 metre peak, 2/3 of the Earth's atmosphere is below you at 8 kilometres. If you were to take the entire world's atmosphere and roll it into a ball at standard temperature and pressure, that is the entire gaseous content of the Earth's atmosphere compared to the size of our globe. The world's atmosphere is incredibly thin. And if you put a huge amount of gas, increasingly, into a very small volume, the concentration will go up. And it is. So here are the more lower data. This is from Hawaii, the so-called Keeling data. And if you look even since 1960, there's been this inexorable rise. If you're interested in why there's an up and a down, this is sort of almost like the Earth breathing. This is the spring, leaves growing and drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And this is the autumn and winter as the leaves fall off and rot and release that carbon dioxide. That's meant to be a flat line down here. The reason it's rising steeply and has done since the 1850s is because of what we're adding. If you put that in a historical context, that's what's happened in the last 10,000 years, and you could say the same thing over many millennia. This is an extraordinary and completely unprecedented rate of rise in carbon dioxide emissions and concentrations. And we've reached at least the highest CO2 concentration for 3 million years, which means that you, even if this room were well ventilated, are breathing a higher CO2 concentration in the atmosphere than any human on the planet has ever breathed before. And we've achieved that in a little over 150 years. And these gases, known as greenhouse gases, have this peculiar phenomenon where they let shortwave radiation through, and they trap some of the long-wave radiation, which means that things warm up. You can just view these as an energy trapping mechanism. And the energy trapping is equivalent to what's known as a radiative forcing of around 1.6 watts of power gain per square metre of the Earth's surface. That's the entire Earth's surface. That's what we're adding to our climate system right now. That doesn't sound very much, but if you just start doing some math for yourself at a maybe 20 metre wide room by maybe 5 metres, so-called 100 square metres, this is running at 160 watts now of energy gain. And you could start putting that around the entire globe. If you turn that into something that's a bit more tangible, we're gaining the energy to our atmosphere of around 5 Hiroshima bombs a second. That's gain to our atmosphere. And if you add energy to an atmosphere, you get weather. That's what causes weather. So you can measure the proxies for this energy gain. You could measure the temperature rise from any study. You can look at what's happening to ice caps. This in 1980 and that in 2012. I'll just do that again. If you watch the ice cap, and there it goes. Here are some numbers to go with that. Massive land and sea ice melt. Loss of extent, but also loss of thickness. And rising sea level. So it doesn't matter much what proxy you want to use. All of these signals are giving you the same story here. Just to nail one, you might have all heard in newspapers people saying for ages, the people who like to deny this sort of science, that temperatures haven't been rising. This graph is lovely. I'm afraid I've truncated it slightly, but many refer to it as the death spiral. So this is the rise in temperature as we're moving out, the temperature going up here as we move further away from the centre. And each revolution is a year. And you can see, as we go in the recent years, there's no sign of a pause there. In fact, there's probably a sign of an acceleration. Now, why does that matter to us? Well, it matters, as our first Lancet Commission report said, that to you and to me and to my children, climate change is the greatest global health threat of the 21st century. I hope you'll put that in context to say that we are in terrible, terrible, terrible trouble anyway, even if this didn't exist. But the problem with climate change is that it's a force multiplier. It exaggerates all of the other impacts of which we spoke earlier. Why? I don't want to bore you with all the data on this, so here's a quick list on some of them. The bits people used to worry about were bacterial growth rates go up, so it's why you get a dodgy tummy in warm climates, a bit of salmonella on the chicken and it grows quicker. But you know what, if you've got a fridge, probably not going to be a particular problem to you. We know that oceanic, river and algal blooms are getting worse and bigger and they are toxic. We know that there are substantial changes actually in vector-borne disease patterns. The particular one of the worry at the moment for the Chinese is dengue, where they've got the biggest dengue outbreak in their known history, and they attribute that directly to climate change, producing changes in weather patterns. We see the same with changes in the snails that carry schistosomiasis or bilharzia and so forth. There are changes in aeroallergen density actually, so the spring is coming earlier and we're getting greater plant growth and of different plants, which is perhaps driving some of the increased asthma rates in North America and in Western Europe. And we have some direct effects. If temperatures rise in cities, that interacts with pollution coming out of cars and increases ground level ozone, which isn't very good for you either. But there are much bigger things at play than that little list that we had there. And as I said to you, if you add energy to climate, to weather systems, to atmospheric systems, you get extreme weather events. So this is the 2003 extreme weather event. And if you're looking at temperature anomalies in West Europe, 6 degrees higher than normal. This is the July 2010 one, which was centered over Moscow, when you're looking at differences in temperature here over expected, well over 10 degrees hotter than you'd expect for the seasonal average. And these sorts of extreme weather events aren't just to do with heating, although those themselves have pretty evil effects. This was what happened with the 2010 heat wave. But you also get flooding, for instance. So in the same year, this is what happened to Pakistan. A fifth of its total land surface area was underwater. And this is familiar to you. You are probably completely inured now to the newspaper headlines, more water fell in 1 hour than fell in the last 3 months, or more rain fell this year than fell in the previous whatever. These records are now tumbling the entire time, and we're used to having extreme weather events, aren't we? They're getting more and more common to the point when we just accept that this is normal, and it's not. This is what's happening to all of those extreme weather events. They are on a steep rise. And those impacts are sometimes direct. They mean you lose your house, they cause sewage to go everywhere, you die of heat directly, but sometimes they cause indirect impacts on human health. So let's give you one example of that. This was the consequence of the 2010 heat wave, which caused a collapse of the grain production in Kazakhstan. And you might not recognize that as being a particularly important grain producer, but it is. It's a very, very, very major world grain producer. And what happened when it became a net importer of grain as opposed to a net exporter is the price of wheat went up from around $150 to around $450 or $350 a metric ton. Now, the supermarkets buffered that for you, so you didn't really notice that in a rise in price of your loaf of bread. But if you had to pay that direct cost and you were poor, this was the difference between being able to feed your family and not. And this is considered to be one of the triggers for the Arab Spring. But whilst there was a lot of political discontent in these regions, one of the triggers was actually the great increase in grain prices. So these sorts of events, by causing displacement of populations and poverty and famine and disease, leads to conflict. And I won't quote the extensive scientific literature that demonstrates that to be the case, but it's true. And the Pentagon, as far back as 13 years ago, were releasing statements like this internally. So this is a Pentagon report saying, yep, climate change is real and we're causing it. And I love this bureaucratic language here. The result could be a significant drop in the human carrying capacity of the Earth's environment. So, impacts of climate change on human health. Yes, heat, direct injury, pollution, allergens, ozone, food-related illness, vectors, drought, flood, crop failure, economic collapse, migration, but war and conflict. But let's not forget that's acting upon an ecosystem that is already collapsing, where 8 species now are becoming extinct, where we've lost pretty much half of the largest multi-celled life on the planet in the last 30 years, and those pressures haven't gone away. It's not looking good then, is it? This is not a position in which you want to be. So I suppose in the last few minutes, the question is, what's our trajectory? Where are we currently heading? Is it as bad as it was, or has humanity gone from Homo sapiens to Homo stultus and now gone back to showing some common sense? Well, the news isn't good. Our demand for energy seems insatiable. And as you can see here, whenever we come up with another clever idea of a way to get a supply of energy, it never displaces the one that went before, it just adds to it. So we find coal, we burn coal, we discover oil, we don't stop burning coal, we burn oil as well as coal. We discover natural gas, doesn't stop us burning oil and coal, we burn more of those, and now we add gas to it, and so forth, whether it's nuclear or renewables or biofuels or anything else that you want to add. So our demand for energy is not slowing down at all, and neither is our use of fossil fuels. The UNFCCC, which tries to work out our trajectories and where we have to be to stay at something that's at least survivable, produces these pathways for CO2 emissions, and they're known as RCPs, or representative concentration pathways. This is the one you want to be on, RCP 2.6. We're already running at 400 parts per million of CO2, but it says let's try and cap that around 420. That, I can tell you right now, which would keep us at around 1.5 to 2 degrees, is a complete non-starter, because you'd have to replant all the agricultural land of Europe with biofuels to draw CO2 down, and that's not happening. So we're going to be worse. This was the worst case scenario. This is RCP 8.5, which basically says business as usual, we don't do anything, and we just keep accelerating in our emissions. That's RCP 8.5. That takes us up from 1 and a bit watts per square metre to 8 and a bit watts per square metre of radiative forcing. And that puts us up to many, many degrees of temperature rise this century in your lifetimes, or if you have children as I do, in my children's lifetimes. The bad news is that we're above that curve at the moment. This was the worst case, and we're exceeding worst case. And what does that mean? Think of everything you've seen so far with extreme weather events and so forth. That's with around 0.9 degrees of temperature rise. Just imagine if you keep adding not just 5 Hiroshima bombs of energy per second, but a lot more, and you keep doing that throughout the century, what might happen? Well, it's probably best summed up by the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society here, of what a 4-degree society means. So that's the end of human civilization, and it will end because of these direct effects, let alone because of the indirect effects as a force multiplier on an already collapsing mass extinction ecosystem. So that joke I told you at the beginning, I've got Homo sapiens, I wouldn't worry, it doesn't last for long, isn't actually so funny anymore at all. Finally, though, I suppose I should leave you with some hope. Is it possible to avert catastrophe? Well, we published the second Lancet Commission a little over a year ago now, which addressed that issue. If you're really interested, it's free to download, and you don't have to read the lot, you can just read the executive summary. But the good news is it is possible. It turns out that all the technology we need to solve this problem actually exists already. We aren't waiting for some magic bullet, it's there. And it turns out there's plenty of money. The only problem is how you connect the money to the technology, and that's a question of political will. How much would it cost? Around $1 trillion a year. That's only about a fifth of what we spend on the health budget anyway. And it's only a small fraction of what we spend anyway maintaining a fossil fuel energy system. So this is not actually technically big bucks. We'll get a lot of it back in direct health benefits, because it turns out that burning fossil fuels and breathing particulate pollution and so forth isn't very good for us. And actually doing things that are low carbon, like walking instead of driving a car, and eating vegetables more than red meat from cows belching methane, turns out to be very good for your human health, as well as for planetary health. And the economic costs, or the economic savings rather, are really substantial. We might get back a quarter of the costs of the mitigation in terms of changing our energy system just from having healthier, happier lives. That's got to be a good thing. And what we all do as individual matters, and this is where I'm going to close, because it's very easy to become paralysed by this sort of view that we're all doomed, Captain Mannering, and that there's nothing we can do about it. But we can do things about it. There are some little small things about lifestyle change. You can all look at your own lives. There are carbon calculators online, and you can work out where the big ticket items are, where you as an individual are contributing most. do that and just work out where you can make your biggest difference. I put a couple in there just out of interest. This is the cost of conferencing. A return flight to a conference in LA is around 1 million litres of CO2 for your personal cost. And this is the cost of large international medical conferences. They are, by the time you've shipped everyone in and they've all lived in their hotel, they are very energy expensive things. So you might want to try to decide if you're going to go to the state-of-the-art meeting, says he, plugging it furiously, in December, as opposed to taking your long-haul flight. These are relatively small beer items, but there are differences in ways of practice. There are some good papers coming out looking at the CO2 costs of different things. And remember that your volatile anaesthetic agents themselves are very powerful greenhouse gases too. They've got long half-lives. And if you look at the average DGH in Britain, in terms of its CO2 equivalents coming from volatile agents, they're pretty substantial. So maybe there's a reason to move over to propofol. And actually the costs in terms of CO2 emissions are moderately substantial for the use of intravenous agents, but they're a lot less than the warming potential of the anaesthetic gases. As I said before, look at your own carbon calculators and see what you can do. But probably the most important thing is to take political action. If you can find a political party left in Britain with whom you can engage, that's proving increasingly difficult. But we need to push this up the agenda to say this really does matter. It matters to me, perhaps a little less as a person, because I'm knocking my late 50s now, and I probably don't have that much life left on the planet, but my children are 11 and 14. And I would like to think they have got a long life. I'd like it to be long and pleasant, not miserable and short. So inaction isn't an option, especially if you're your age or if you do have youngsters. And we need to respond as individuals and as a profession in the way that we would for anything else. But climate change is a medical emergency. Thanks very much for your time.